Elijah Marsh had swept these floors for 11 years, and in all that time, not one person in that building had ever asked him his last name. To them, he was simply the janitor, a quiet man in gray coveralls who appeared before sunrise and disappeared after the last bell rang, a fixture as forgettable as the mop bucket he pushed down empty hallways. He moved through the school with the kind of practiced invisibility that only comes from years of choosing not to be seen, greeting students with a small nod, greeting teachers with an even smaller one, never lingering long enough in anyone's memory to become more than a fixture. He had learned, long before he ever set foot in this building, that some of the most powerful people in a room are often the ones nobody bothers to look at twice. But on the morning everything changed, 300 students and 40 staff members packed into the gymnasium for an emergency assembly, unaware they were about to witness a moment that would haunt this school for years to come. Word had spread quickly that morning that Principal Grace Yoon had called for an unscheduled gathering, and the rumor mill inside those hallways moved faster than any announcement system ever could. Some students whispered about a funding cut, others guessed a change in dress code policy. Nobody, not even the teachers filing into the bleachers with their arms crossed and their coffee cups still warm, could have guessed that the assembly had been called to strip one man of his dignity in front of an audience he had spent over a decade quietly protecting. Principal Grace Yoon stood at the podium, her voice sharp and rehearsed, and called Elijah forward in front of everyone he had quietly protected for over a decade. She had practiced this moment the night before, in the mirror of her office bathroom, adjusting her tone until it struck the exact balance of authority and disappointment she believed a leader should project. She did not know, as she called his name into the microphone, that she was about to make the single most consequential mistake of her professional life. She saw only an opportunity, a chance to demonstrate to the visiting board members seated near the back that she ran a tight, accountable institution, one where no employee, regardless of how long they had served, operated outside her control. What happened next would humiliate a man who had given this institution more than anyone in that room could possibly imagine, and not a single person watching knew the truth that was about to unravel their entire world. Elijah walked forward slowly, his footsteps echoing across the gymnasium floor he himself had once approved the funding to resurface. He kept his eyes low, not out of shame, but out of a lifetime of discipline that told him dignity was best protected in silence rather than confrontation. Students who had shared quiet conversations with him during lonely lunch periods sat frozen in their seats, uncertain what they were witnessing, sensing only that something deeply wrong was unfolding in front of them, though none of them yet understood exactly what. Grace Yoon didn't hesitate. She held up a folder, thin and unremarkable, and announced to the room that Elijah Marsh had been terminated, effective immediately, for what she called unauthorized access to school property. Her voice carried across the gymnasium with practiced precision, each word chosen to project certainty, even as the folder in her hand contained nothing more than a single misread financial report. She had not called him into her office privately. She had not asked him a single question before drafting his termination letter the night before. She had decided, based on assumption alone, that a man who spent his days pushing a mop through empty hallways posed enough of a threat to warrant public humiliation in front of every student and teacher in the building. She stripped his badge from his chest herself, in front of children who had known his face longer than they known their own teachers' names, and she said the words that would later be replayed in whispers throughout every hallway of that school. "People like you don't belong walking these halls pretending you have a place here." The gymnasium fell silent, the kind of silence that presses against the chest and makes breathing feel deliberate. A group of freshman girls near the back exchanged uneasy glances, remembering the mornings Elijah had quietly left granola bars in their lockers during a week none of them had eaten breakfast. A teacher named Mrs. Alvarez gripped the edge of the bleacher, unsure whether to speak up or stay silent, caught between loyalty to her principal and a growing unease she couldn't yet explain. Students who had shared quiet conversations with Elijah during lonely lunch periods looked away, unsure whether to feel embarrassed for him or for themselves. A junior named Tyrell Combs, who had once told Elijah about his father's incarceration during a slow afternoon in the supply hallway, felt something twist uncomfortably in his stomach as he watched the only adult who had ever truly listened to him get stripped of his badge like a criminal. Teachers who had never once questioned his presence suddenly wondered what secret truth had finally caught up with the man in gray, quietly reassessing years of small interactions, wondering if they had missed some warning sign hiding beneath his quiet demeanor all along. Nobody in that room, least of all Grace Yoon, understood what they had just witnessed, or who they had just cast out. Elijah said nothing. He simply nodded, picked up the small bag he kept beneath the utility closet, and walked out through the double doors into the parking lot, leaving behind a silence so heavy that even the students could feel it pressing against their chests. He did not look back toward the gymnasium, though he could feel hundreds of eyes following his slow, deliberate walk across the polished floor. He passed a mural near the exit that he himself had funded 3 years earlier, a colorful tribute to the school's history, painted by students during an after-school arts program he had quietly sponsored without ever revealing his involvement. He paused there for only a moment, long enough to remember why he had chosen this particular sacrifice in the first place, before pushing open the door and stepping out into the cold morning air. The screen went black, and in that darkness, a single truth began to surface, one that would soon turn this entire story upside down. Somewhere beyond that gymnasium, beyond the whispers already spreading through hallway group chats and nervous text messages home, a reality existed that none of the 300 students or 40 staff members inside that building had ever considered. The man they had just watched get publicly humiliated was not simply an employee who had overstepped his boundaries. He was the very foundation this school stood on, in every sense of the word, and the woman who fired him had no understanding of the ground she was standing on when she made her decision. What Grace Yoon did not know, what nobody in that gymnasium could have possibly imagined, was that the building she had just humiliated a man inside of, every brick laid, every salary paid, every light switch that flickered on each morning, belonged to him. The renovation that saved this school from closing its doors years earlier, the very roof over every head in that gymnasium, existed because of a quiet sacrifice made by the same man Grace Yoon had just called unworthy of walking these halls. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because this story was never really about a janitor being fired. It was about a woman who built her entire career standing on ground she never once thought to ask who truly owned. And a man who had spent 11 quiet years watching over a place that carried more of his blood, his sacrifice, and his family's legacy than she could have dreamed. Somewhere in a locked drawer inside a downtown law office, a document had been waiting patiently for this exact moment. A document that would soon force Grace Yoon to confront the full weight of what she had done in front of an entire gymnasium. But that reveal was still ahead of us. For now, all anyone knew was that a quiet man had been thrown out of a building he had protected in silence, and that the woman who fired him had no idea what was coming for her. Elijah Marsh had not always been a man who mopped floors in silence. Long before anyone at this school ever called him the janitor, he had been a young man full of ambition, raised in a modest neighborhood by a mother who cleaned office buildings at night, so her son could attend a decent school during the day. Her name was Ruth Marsh, and she worked 2 jobs for most of Elijah's childhood, leaving before dawn and returning long after midnight, her hands perpetually cracked from industrial cleaning chemicals she could never quite scrub out from beneath her fingernails. Elijah remembered waiting up for her some nights, not out of worry, but simply because he wanted a few minutes of her company before exhaustion claimed her for the few hours of sleep she allowed herself. She never complained. She simply worked, quietly and without bitterness, believing that her sacrifice was the only inheritance she could offer her son. Elijah watched her work herself to exhaustion, and he made himself a quiet promise that one day, no child would ever have to feel invisible the way he sometimes felt growing up. He remembered specific moments with painful clarity, the school assemblies his mother could never attend because her shift started too early, the parent-teacher conferences where other children's fathers showed up in suits while his mother sent a handwritten note apologizing for her absence. He carried no resentment toward her, only toward a system that seemed to value certain kinds of labor less than others, that treated the woman who kept entire office buildings clean and functional as somehow less deserving of recognition than the executives who worked inside them each day. That quiet observation planted itself deep inside him, long before he understood what to do with it. He studied hard, worked harder, and eventually built a small but successful construction and property business that grew far beyond what anyone from his old neighborhood could have predicted. His early years in the industry were unglamorous, mixing concrete before sunrise, learning electrical wiring from men twice his age who initially doubted a young black man could keep pace with the physical demands of the trade. He proved himself through consistency rather than confrontation, letting his work speak in ways his words never needed to. Within a decade, he had built a reputation for taking on renovation projects other contractors avoided, buildings considered too far gone to save, communities considered too underfunded to matter. He found a strange satisfaction in resurrecting places others had written off, understanding on some deeper level that he was really rebuilding pieces of his own childhood each time he restored a crumbling structure into something functional again. But wealth never changed who Elijah Marsh was at his core. He remained a man who valued quiet dignity over public recognition, a man who believed the truest measure of character was how you treated people who could offer you nothing in return. He drove the same modest truck for years after his business became profitable enough to afford something far more impressive. He wore simple clothing, avoided public events tied to his success, and quietly directed a significant portion of his earnings toward scholarship funds and community projects that never carried his name. When reporters occasionally reached out after word of his business success spread through local circles, he declined every interview request, uncomfortable with the idea of his mother's sacrifice being reduced to an inspirational headline for strangers to consume and forget by the following week. It was through that same construction business that Elijah first became involved with the school years before Grace Yoon ever arrived. He had been contracted, years earlier, to assess structural damage in a neighboring building, and during that visit, he noticed the school next door in far worse condition than anyone in the district seemed willing to acknowledge publicly. Water damage had compromised sections of the roof. Electrical wiring throughout the building violated safety codes that had gone unenforced for years due to budget shortfalls. The gymnasium floor, the very floor he would one day be publicly humiliated on, had warped so severely from water exposure that a portion of it had been roped off entirely, deemed unsafe for student use. The district had quietly begun drafting closure plans, believing the building beyond reasonable repair given available funding. The building had been failing, its foundation crumbling both literally and financially, and the district was prepared to shut its doors for good. Elijah, moved by memories of his own mother's sacrifices, quietly purchased the property through a private trust and funded its renovation from the ground up, asking for nothing in return except one condition: that his involvement remain confidential. He structured the arrangement carefully with his attorney, a young associate named Marcus Webb, who had only recently joined the firm handling Elijah's business affairs. Marcus remembered the meeting clearly, remembered Elijah explaining, without any trace of self-importance, that he wanted children in that building to have the kind of stability his own mother had fought so hard to provide him, without ever knowing whose money had made it possible. He never wanted his name on a plaque or his face in a newspaper. He simply wanted the doors to stay open for children who needed them. When the renovation was complete, the district celebrated the sudden reversal of fortune with a small ceremony, thanking an anonymous donor whose generosity had saved the building. Elijah watched a recording of that ceremony privately, alone in his office, feeling a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with recognition and everything to do with knowing children would walk through safe hallways the following Monday morning. Few people beyond his lawyer and one trusted board member ever knew the truth. To everyone else, the school simply reopened, as if by miracle, with new textbooks, repaired ceilings, and a future it hadn't had before. Grace Yoon arrived 2 years later, hired as principal on the strength of her polished resume and her reputation for turning struggling schools into award-winning institutions. She came from a district 3 states away, where she had implemented aggressive performance metrics that improved test scores but left several veteran teachers feeling sidelined by her rigid management style. Her resume highlighted these improvements prominently, framing her leadership as decisive and results-driven, qualities the hiring board found immediately appealing given the district's ongoing pressure to demonstrate measurable progress. Grace had grown up the daughter of Korean immigrants who ran a small dry cleaning business, working double shifts for decades to give their daughter opportunities they never had access to themselves. She carried her parents' relentless work ethic into every professional decision, but somewhere along the way, that ethic had hardened into something closer to control than compassion. She was sharp, calculated, and deeply aware of optics, understanding that donors and school boards responded to confidence and control. In her first months at the school, she implemented a series of policy changes designed to project immediate authority, tightening dress codes, restructuring staff meeting protocols, and establishing a clearer chain of command that left little room for the informal warmth the building had operated under previously. Longtime staff members, including Mrs. Alvarez, noticed the shift immediately, though most chose to adapt quietly rather than challenge a new principal eager to prove herself. Grace believed, perhaps sincerely, that her approach would ultimately benefit the students, never fully recognizing that some of the informal warmth she was systematically eliminating had been carefully built by people who genuinely understood what these particular students needed. What Grace never learned, because she never once thought to ask, was who had truly saved the building she now ran. She assumed, as most people did, that the renovations had come from a district grant or a nameless corporate sponsor, an assumption reinforced by vague language in old district records that referenced only a private trust contribution without further detail. She never dug deeper into the specifics, never wondered why maintenance requests for the building always seemed to receive unusually fast approval, never questioned why certain repairs happened almost immediately while neighboring schools waited months for similar district funding. She built her reputation inside walls she believed belonged to the system, never imagining they belonged to a man she would one day pass in the hallway without a second glance. A man in gray coveralls who said good morning to her every single day. Elijah began working at the school not out of necessity, but out of a quiet need to stay close to the place his sacrifice had saved. He took the janitor position under a different last name arrangement through the trust, choosing to remain anonymous even in employment records, watching over hallways he once rebuilt with his own resources. His attorney had structured the arrangement carefully, ensuring his employment records referenced only initials and a processing designation tied to the trust rather than his full legal identity, a level of anonymity that satisfied both his desire for privacy and district hiring requirements. He arrived each morning before sunrise, moving through the building with quiet familiarity, checking on repairs he had personally funded years earlier, noticing small details about the building's condition that no ordinary custodian would think to monitor so closely. He formed gentle, unassuming bonds with students who felt unseen, the same way he once had. He noticed Terrell Combs sitting alone during lunch periods within his first few months at the school, recognizing something familiar in the boy's quiet withdrawal, a heaviness that reminded him of his own childhood isolation. He began leaving small gestures of encouragement, a granola bar left discreetly in a locker during a week he noticed the boy skipping breakfast, a quiet word of encouragement before a difficult exam, never enough to draw attention, but consistent enough to matter. He left encouraging notes in lockers of children going through hard times, signing them simply with a small drawn star rather than his name, wanting students to feel supported without feeling indebted to anyone specific. He quietly funded field trips for kids who couldn't afford them, routing the money through an anonymous school fund so no one would trace it back to him. When a group of students were selected for a regional science competition but lacked transportation funding, Elijah arranged for a donation through the trust within days, careful to ensure the paperwork routed through channels that would never reveal his involvement. Mrs. Alvarez, who oversaw the science program, often wondered privately about the mysterious fund that seemed to materialize exactly when students needed it most, though she never connected it to the quiet man who emptied her classroom trash each evening. To the students who noticed him, he was kind, steady, and endlessly patient. To Grace Yoon, he was simply staff, a man whose name she never bothered to learn correctly, referring to him only as the cleaning man whenever his presence needed acknowledging at all. Tension between them had been building long before the assembly, though neither of them recognized it for what it was. Grace grew increasingly irritated by Elijah's quiet familiarity with students and staff, feeling it undermined her authority in ways she couldn't quite articulate. She noticed him exchanging warm greetings with Tyrell Combs one morning near the gymnasium entrance and felt an unexplainable flash of irritation, as though his easy rapport with a student who rarely spoke to anyone else somehow diminished her own carefully constructed leadership image. She began questioning his presence during sensitive meetings, uncomfortable with a janitor who seemed to know more about the school's inner workings than his position should have allowed, unaware that his knowledge stemmed from literal ownership rather than any inappropriate overreach on his part. What Grace interpreted as suspicious overreach was, in truth, the simple awareness of a man who had built the very halls she walked through. When Elijah mentioned offhand during a maintenance discussion that the roofing material used in the East Wing needed replacement within the next 2 years, Grace found his specific knowledge unsettling rather than helpful, quietly noting it as one more example of a custodian overstepping boundaries she believed should remain firmly in place. She began documenting small interactions in a private file, building what she believed was evidence of inappropriate behavior, never once considering that his familiarity with the building's structural history came from a level of investment far beyond anything a normal employee could claim. Elijah, for his part, began sensing that his time of quiet anonymity was drawing to a close, that circumstances were slowly shifting toward a moment where the truth could no longer stay buried. He noticed Grace's growing coldness toward him, the clipped tone she used whenever addressing him directly, the way she seemed to actively avoid acknowledging his presence in shared spaces. He mentioned this shift briefly to Marcus Webb during a routine trust review meeting, wondering aloud whether his anonymity might eventually become unsustainable given Grace's apparent discomfort with his presence. Marcus assured him the legal structure protecting his identity remained secure, though neither of them anticipated the specific circumstances that would eventually force the truth into the open. Neither of them could have predicted just how publicly, and how painfully, that truth would finally surface. The days leading up to the assembly began with something small, almost invisible within the ordinary rhythm of school operations, the kind of bureaucratic detail that most people would never think twice about. A routine district-wide financial audit had been scheduled months in advance, part of a standard review process applied to every school within the district on a rotating basis. Grace Yoon had welcomed the audit initially, viewing it as another opportunity to demonstrate the disciplined, results-driven leadership she had built her entire reputation around. She spent an entire weekend organizing budget reports, confident that her tight oversight of school finances would reflect well against the loose management style of her predecessor, never anticipating that the audit would uncover something she completely misunderstood. The auditor assigned to the school, a methodical man named Harold Pruitt, flagged an unusual transaction buried within the maintenance budget from several months earlier, a transfer of funds that did not match the standard district allocation process. The amount had been designated for emergency roof repairs, authorized through a private trust rather than typical district channels, a detail that immediately struck Harold as irregular given his unfamiliarity with the school's unique funding history. He noted the discrepancy in his preliminary report without further investigation, simply flagging it as an item requiring clarification from school leadership, unaware that his routine observation was about to set off a chain of events far beyond his understanding. Grace received Harold's preliminary findings on a Tuesday afternoon, reading through the flagged transaction with growing unease. She had no memory of authorizing any emergency roof repair funding through a private trust, and the unfamiliar terminology immediately triggered her instinct towards suspicion rather than curiosity. She pulled the maintenance request logs from months earlier, searching for any documentation explaining the transfer, but found only a brief, vaguely worded authorization referencing trust-approved emergency maintenance, signed with initials she didn't immediately recognize. Rather than escalating her confusion to the district office or requesting clarification through proper channels, Grace allowed her mounting frustration with what she perceived as loose financial oversight to guide her next decision. She began quietly reviewing personnel files, searching for any employee with irregular access to maintenance budget systems, eventually landing on Elijah Marsh's employment record, thin and unusually vague compared to other staff files. The record listed only initials, rather than a full legal name, referenced employment through an outside processing arrangement she didn't fully understand, and contained none of the standard background documentation typically required for district hiring. To Grace, unfamiliar with the specific trust arrangement Marcus Webb had structured years earlier, This irregularity read as a red flag rather than a legitimate confidentiality protection. She convinced herself, without further investigation, that she had uncovered evidence of a longtime employee quietly manipulating school finances under the district's nose. Grace spent that entire Wednesday evening alone in her office, building what she believed was an airtight case against a man she had never once had a substantive conversation with. She cross-referenced maintenance request dates with Elijah's shift schedule, noting with growing conviction that he was often present during after-hours building access when several irregular transactions had processed. She failed to consider the far simpler explanation that as the building's actual owner working evening shifts, his presence during those hours was entirely unremarkable. Her mind, already primed by months of quiet irritation toward a janitor whose familiarity with the building unsettled her, quickly assembled a narrative that fit her existing assumptions rather than the more complicated truth sitting just beyond her awareness. By Thursday morning, Grace had convinced herself she was dealing with a serious breach of trust, requiring immediate, decisive action. She drafted a termination letter that evening, citing unauthorized access to school financial systems as the official justification, though her actual evidence amounted to nothing more than an unfamiliar authorization signature and a pattern of scheduling she had misread entirely. She considered, briefly, addressing the matter privately with Elijah before taking action, a normal step any reasonable administrator might follow. But something in her calculated mind resisted that option, recognizing an opportunity to demonstrate her decisiveness publicly in front of visiting board members scheduled to observe school operations the following morning, a demonstration she believed would strengthen her standing within the district. Diane Coker, the board chair, had scheduled her visit weeks earlier as part of a routine leadership evaluation, intending only to observe general school operations and gather feedback from staff regarding Grace's ongoing performance. She had no knowledge of the termination Grace planned to announce, no indication that her routine visit was about to become the backdrop for a moment that would eventually force her to confront uncomfortable truths about the principal she had personally recommended for hiring 3 years earlier. She arrived that Friday morning expecting a standard tour and a handful of staff meetings, entirely unprepared for what Grace had arranged to unfold in the gymnasium before her. Marcus Webb's presence at the assembly had been arranged separately, entirely unrelated to Grace's termination plans. He had been invited weeks earlier as a formality, representing outside legal consultation the district occasionally used for policy review purposes, a role that had nothing to do with the school's ownership structure or Elijah's employment. He arrived that morning with no expectation beyond a routine, unremarkable observation, carrying only a notepad and the mild disinterest of someone anticipating an uneventful meeting. He took a seat near the back of the gymnasium, glancing briefly at the agenda handed to him at the door, unaware that within the hour, a name would surface that would completely upend his understanding of the morning's purpose. The gymnasium filled gradually that morning, students shuffling in with the particular restlessness reserved for unscheduled assemblies, teachers exchanging quiet speculation about the purpose behind the sudden gathering. Tyrell Combs sat near the middle bleachers, unaware that the man who had quietly supported him through some of his hardest weeks was about to become the center of a public reckoning. Mrs. Alvarez took her usual seat near the science department's designated section, glancing occasionally toward the gymnasium doors, sensing an unusual tension in the air, though she couldn't identify its source. Grace stood backstage, reviewing note cards one final time, rehearsing the exact tone she intended to project, confident that her decision, however severe, would ultimately be read as a demonstration of strong, uncompromising leadership. What followed in that gymnasium has already been told, the badge stripped from Elijah's chest, the silence that swallowed 300 students and 40 staff members whole, the quiet, dignified walk toward the parking lot that left a building full of witnesses uncertain what they had just seen. But few in that room understood, as Grace's rehearsed words echoed off the walls, that a single name spoken aloud during that humiliation had already begun quietly rewriting the entire trajectory of everyone present. Marcus Webb sat frozen in his seat near the back, his notepad forgotten, his mind racing backward through old case files he hadn't thought about in years, recognizing a name he had once been sworn to protect through absolute confidentiality. Marcus Webb did not sleep well that night, the name Elijah Marsh replaying in his mind with an insistence he couldn't quite shake loose. He had heard hundreds of names over his years practicing law, most fading from memory within days of closing a file, but this particular name carried weight he hadn't expected to feel again after so many years. He rose before dawn, made coffee he barely touched, and drove to his firm's downtown office well before his usual arrival time, unable to wait until a reasonable hour to confirm what his instincts were already telling him, with growing certainty. The building's parking garage was nearly empty when he pulled in, the early morning quiet matching the unsettled feeling that had followed him since the previous day's assembly. He requested access to the firm's archived records, a process that typically took hours given the volume of files accumulated over decades of practice. But Marcus pushed through the bureaucracy with an urgency his colleagues found slightly unusual for a Saturday morning. He remembered the general time frame of the trust structuring, the specific language Elijah had insisted upon regarding absolute confidentiality, the careful legal architecture designed to ensure his ownership remained invisible to anyone who might come looking. Marcus had been a junior associate then, assigned to assist a senior partner who had since retired, tasked primarily with drafting supporting documentation, while the more experienced attorney handled direct client communication. He remembered Elijah's quiet insistence during their only face-to-face meeting that his name never appear on any document accessible through standard public records searches. By mid-morning, Marcus had located the original trust filing, confirming everything his memory had suggested the previous evening. Elijah Marsh had indeed structured majority ownership of the school's founding property trust over a decade earlier, funding its complete renovation through funds routed carefully to avoid any traceable connection to district records or public announcements. Marcus cross-referenced the property title with current district documentation, confirming that the vague, private trust contribution language Grace had encountered during her own limited research traced directly back to this exact filing. He sat back in his chair, absorbing the full weight of what he now understood, recognizing that the man publicly humiliated in that gymnasium the previous morning held more legal authority over that building than Grace Yoon, the school board, or the district superintendent combined. Marcus considered his next steps carefully throughout that Saturday afternoon, understanding the delicate nature of what he had uncovered. His professional obligation to maintain client confidentiality remained absolute, meaning he could not simply announce his discovery to the school board without first consulting Elijah directly. He also recognized the broader implications extending beyond simple legal technicality, understanding that Grace Yoon had built her entire justification for firing Elijah on a fundamental misunderstanding of financial transactions that were, in reality, entirely authorized by the building's rightful owner. He drafted a careful voicemail message that evening, requesting a private meeting with Grace regarding what he described only as an urgent matter concerning school ownership records, deliberately vague enough to protect confidentiality, while conveying sufficient urgency to ensure her prompt response. Grace received Marcus's voicemail late Saturday evening, dismissing it initially as unrelated bureaucratic follow-up connected to grant paperwork or routine district compliance matters. She had spent the weekend feeling largely satisfied with how Friday's assembly had unfolded, believing she had successfully demonstrated the kind of decisive leadership that would strengthen her standing with Diane Coker and the broader school board. She replayed the moment repeatedly in her mind, not with guilt, but with a strange sense of professional accomplishment, convinced she had protected the school from financial misconduct through swift, uncompromising action. She had no idea, as she prepared for Monday's scheduled follow-up meeting with Marcus, that her entire understanding of the previous day's events was about to collapse entirely. Meanwhile, word of the firing had already spread far beyond the school's hallways over that same weekend. A short video clip, recorded quietly by a student sitting near the back of the gymnasium, had been uploaded online Friday evening and was gaining unexpected traction by Saturday morning. The footage captured only 30 seconds, Grace's voice delivering her final dismissive line, Elijah's quiet, dignified walk toward the gymnasium exit, but something about the raw emotional weight of that brief clip resonated far beyond the school community. Viewers were drawn not to any explicit detail, but to the visible discomfort on the faces of students watching a quiet man be publicly humiliated by someone with far more power, a dynamic that struck a nerve with audiences far removed from this particular school district. Comments filled with speculation, began appearing beneath the video within hours, some defending Grace's authority to make personnel decisions without public scrutiny, others condemning what they perceived as needless cruelty toward a man who had never caused anyone visible harm. Tyrell Combs, scrolling through his phone that Saturday afternoon, felt a strange mixture of vindication and unease, watching strangers debate a moment he had personally witnessed, wishing he had spoken up in that gymnasium rather than simply watching in silence like everyone else. Mrs. Alvarez discovered the video through a colleague's text message that same evening, watching it 3 times in a row, each viewing deepening her growing suspicion that Grace's decision had been built on considerably shakier ground than the confident announcement suggested. The district's communications office noticed the growing online attention by Sunday morning, quietly reaching out to Grace for clarification regarding the circumstances behind the sudden termination, careful to frame their inquiry as routine rather than alarmed. Grace responded with practiced confidence, reiterating the financial misconduct narrative she had built throughout the previous week, still entirely unaware that the very transaction she cited as evidence had been personally authorized by the man she fired. She found herself, without realizing it, trapped between a mounting public relations situation she believed she could manage through careful messaging and a private legal reality about to prove far more consequential than any amount of online criticism could ever become. That evening, Marcus finally reached Elijah directly, having spent most of the weekend carefully considering how to approach a conversation he knew would be difficult, regardless of how he framed it. He drove to Elijah's modest home on the outskirts of the district, choosing an in-person conversation over the impersonal distance of a phone call, understanding intuitively that this particular truth deserved to be delivered with the same quiet dignity Elijah had always extended toward others. Elijah answered the door, still dressed in casual weekend clothing, greeting Marcus with the same calm, unhurried demeanor he carried into every interaction, betraying no outward indication of the weight he had been quietly carrying since Friday's humiliation. Marcus explained everything methodically: the audit discrepancy, Grace's misunderstanding of the authorized trust transaction, the viral video already circulating online, and his own discovery confirming Elijah's ownership status beyond any reasonable doubt. Elijah listened without interruption, his expression calm throughout, though something briefly flickered across his features when Marcus mentioned the video, a quiet concern that had nothing to do with his own reputation and everything to do with how the students in that gymnasium were processing what they had witnessed. When Marcus finished, Elijah asked only one question, his voice steady but genuinely curious, whether the students were doing all right after everything that happened. Marcus, somewhat surprised by the question given everything else at stake, confirmed that the school administration had said nothing publicly to reassure students, that as far as he understood, no counseling or communication had been offered to help them process what they had witnessed. Elijah sat with that information for a long moment, staring toward the window overlooking his modest backyard, visibly troubled by this detail more than anything else Marcus had shared. He thought of Tyrell Combs specifically, remembering the boy's quiet vulnerability during their conversations in the supply hallway, wondering how Friday's assembly had affected a student who already carried enough weight without witnessing further evidence that the adults around him could not always be trusted. He did not want revenge. He did not want headlines. He wanted the truth handled with the same quiet dignity he had tried to maintain throughout his entire ownership of the building. He explained this to Marcus plainly, articulating a vision for how this situation should unfold that prioritized the students' well-being and Grace's opportunity for genuine accountability over any public spectacle or legal retribution. Marcus listened carefully, recognizing in Elijah's measured response the same quiet integrity that had defined every interaction between them over the years, understanding that whatever resolution emerged from this situation would need to honor that same restraint rather than simply satisfying a more conventional desire for justice. He instructed Marcus to schedule a formal meeting with the full school board, not to punish Grace publicly, but to ensure the truth was finally acknowledged in the same room where his humiliation had taken place. It was, he said, the only way the students would understand what had really happened, recognizing intuitively that a private resolution, however legally sound, would leave the public humiliation unaddressed in the very space where it occurred. Marcus agreed, promising to coordinate directly with Diane Coker to arrange the meeting discreetly, careful to avoid further public attention before Elijah had the opportunity to address the situation on his own terms rather than through additional viral speculation. The board meeting was scheduled for the following week, and word of its unusual urgency spread quickly among staff, though no one outside Marcus, Elijah, and Grace understood its true purpose. Diane Coker received Marcus's request for an emergency session with visible confusion, unaccustomed to legal counsel requesting board time with such deliberate vagueness regarding the meeting's actual content. She agreed nonetheless, sensing something significant beneath Marcus's careful phrasing, unaware that she was about to preside over a reckoning that would force her to reconsider every assumption she had made about the principal she had personally championed for hiring 3 years earlier. Grace spent those days in quiet panic, reviewing every decision she had made since arriving at the school, searching for some way to control a narrative that had already slipped entirely out of her hands. She drafted resignation letters she never sent, deleting each one after rereading them, uncertain whether resignation represented appropriate accountability or simple cowardice in the face of a situation she still didn't fully understand. She rehearsed apologies she wasn't sure she meant, practicing different versions in her office mirror during quiet moments between meetings, each attempt feeling hollow against the growing dread building steadily beneath her composed exterior. She replayed the assembly in her mind repeatedly, each time recognizing more clearly the cruelty in her own words, though she still lacked the crucial piece of information that would fully explain why this particular situation felt so unusually consequential. For the first time since taking her position, Grace Yoon understood that her downfall would not come from a scandal she could manage through careful messaging. It would come from a truth she had overlooked simply because she never thought someone like Elijah Marsh deserved her attention, a realization that settled over her with increasing weight as the scheduled board meeting drew closer, though she still could not have predicted the exact shape that reckoning would ultimately take. The morning of the board meeting arrived with a stillness that felt entirely different from the chaos of the previous week, the kind of quiet that settles over a building right before something irreversible is about to happen. Diane Coker arrived at the school earlier than usual, choosing to walk the hallways alone before the meeting began, observing the building with a scrutiny she hadn't applied during her previous visits. She passed the mural near the gymnasium entrance, the one funded quietly years earlier by a man she still knew only as the janitor, pausing briefly to admire its detail without understanding its significance. She had spent the past several days fielding concerned calls from other board members, all of them confused by Marcus Webb's unusually urgent request for an emergency session, none of them able to offer any insight into what specifically warranted such secrecy. Elijah arrived at the school that morning, earlier than his usual shift, though he had not come to clean floors. He sat alone in his truck in the parking lot for several minutes, the same parking lot he had once helped repave, gathering himself before stepping out in the tailored suit Marcus had encouraged him to wear, a garment so unfamiliar to his daily life that he had needed his attorney's help simply tying the tie correctly. He caught his reflection briefly in the truck's side mirror, hardly recognizing the man staring back, someone who looked more like the successful businessman he had built himself into than the quiet custodian this building had come to know him as. He took a slow breath, thought briefly of his mother, gone now nearly 6 years but still present in every decision he made regarding this place, and walked toward the entrance with steady, deliberate steps. Staff members who passed him in the hallway did a double-take, unsure whether to greet him as the man they once dismissed or the stranger now standing before them. Mrs. Alvarez, arriving early to prepare her classroom, nearly walked past him entirely before recognition stopped her mid-stride, her expression shifting rapidly from confusion to something closer to dawning understanding as she noticed the confident, unhurried way he carried himself, so different from the careful invisibility he usually projected. She said nothing, simply nodding toward him with a newfound respect she couldn't yet fully explain, sensing intuitively that whatever was about to unfold in that boardroom carried significance far beyond an ordinary personnel matter. Grace watched him walk toward the boardroom from her office window, her stomach tightening with a dread she had never experienced in her career. She had arrived early that morning as well, having spent most of the previous night rehearsing various scenarios for how this meeting might unfold, none of which had prepared her for the sight of Elijah Marsh walking through these halls dressed in a manner that immediately unsettled every assumption she had built about him. She recognized, watching him disappear through the boardroom doors, that something fundamental about her understanding of the previous week's events was about to be dismantled entirely, though she still couldn't have predicted the specific shape that dismantling would take. The boardroom fell silent as Elijah Marsh took his seat at the head of the table, a position he had never once occupied in all his years quietly walking these halls. The room itself felt unusually formal for what board members typically expected from routine sessions. 5 members seated around the polished conference table, Diane Coker positioned at the head opposite Elijah, Marcus Webb standing slightly behind him with a leather folder containing documentation that would soon reshape everyone's understanding of the building they had gathered inside. Grace entered last, taking the seat furthest from Elijah, her posture stiff with an anxiety she was struggling to conceal beneath her usual composed exterior. Marcus Webb stood beside him, methodically distributing copies of the original trust documents to each board member present, watching their expressions shift as they began reading through the carefully organized paperwork. He had spent considerable time the previous evening preparing the materials, ensuring every relevant document was included: property deeds, trust agreements, renovation funding records, all clearly organized to leave no room for doubt or confusion regarding what these papers definitively proved. He distributed the final copy to Grace last, watching her hands tremble slightly as she began reading, her eyes moving rapidly across pages that were systematically dismantling the entire narrative she had constructed over the past week. Grace Yoon sat near the far end of the table, her hands folded tightly in her lap, watching the faces around her shift from confusion to visible shock as they absorbed what the paperwork revealed. Board member after board member looked up from their documents with expressions ranging from disbelief to quiet horror, several exchanging glances that conveyed a shared, unspoken recognition of the magnitude of what Grace had done. One board member, an older gentleman named Frank Delgado, who had served on the board for over a decade, set his papers down slowly, removing his glasses to rub his eyes, as though the physical gesture might somehow help him process information that felt almost too significant to be real. The board chair, a stern woman named Diane Coker, read the ownership records aloud for the room, confirming that Elijah Marsh had held majority control of the school's founding trust for over a decade, funding every renovation, every safety upgrade, and even the very payroll system that had processed his own janitorial paycheck each month. Her voice remained steady throughout the reading, though anyone paying close attention would have noticed the subtle tightening in her jaw, the barely perceptible tremor in her hands as she turned each page. She had personally recommended Grace for hiring 3 years earlier, vouching enthusiastically for her leadership potential during a competitive selection process, and the weight of that endorsement now felt considerably heavier given what she was currently reading aloud to the room. Diane Coker turned to Grace, her voice measured but unmistakably firm, and asked her to explain, in front of the very board she had once impressed with her confidence, why she had chosen to publicly humiliate a man without first verifying the claims she made against him. The question hung in the air with a weight that made several board members shift uncomfortably in their seats, aware they were witnessing something far more significant than a routine personnel review. Grace opened her mouth to respond, drawing on the same practiced confidence she had relied upon throughout her career, but found the words dissolving before they could take shape, no rehearsed explanation feeling adequate against the mounting evidence spread across the table before her. She admitted, quietly and without her usual polish, that she had acted out of assumption rather than investigation, that she had looked at a man in gray coveralls and decided, without evidence, that he did not deserve the basic respect of being asked for his side of the story. Her voice cracked slightly as she continued, acknowledging that she had built an entire narrative around unfamiliar paperwork and a personal discomfort with Elijah's quiet familiarity throughout the building, discomfort she now recognized had clouded her judgment far more than she had allowed herself to previously admit. She glanced briefly toward Elijah as she spoke, unable to maintain eye contact for more than a few seconds, the weight of his calm, patient presence somehow making her admission feel even more difficult than if he had responded with visible anger instead. The room absorbed her admission in heavy silence, several board members exchanging uncomfortable glances, none more troubled than Diane herself, who had personally approved Grace's hiring 3 years earlier. Frank Delgado finally broke the silence, asking Grace directly whether she had reviewed any employee handbook protocols regarding proper investigation procedures before drafting a termination letter, a question that carried the quiet weight of someone who had sat through enough personnel disputes over the years to recognize a clear procedural failure when he saw one. Grace acknowledged that she had bypassed standard investigation protocols entirely, prioritizing what she believed was decisive leadership over the careful verification process her position actually required. Elijah listened to Grace's admission without visible anger, his expression calm, almost tired, as though he had long ago made peace with the possibility that this moment might come. He had spent considerable time during the drive to this meeting considering how he wanted to respond, recognizing that his reaction in this room would shape not only Grace's future, but the broader lesson this entire situation might offer to everyone who eventually learned what had happened. When Diane asked if he wished to speak, he nodded slowly and addressed the room directly for the first time since the meeting began, his voice carrying the same quiet, measured tone that had defined every interaction he'd had within these halls over the past 11 years. He explained that he never wanted recognition for saving this school, that his mother's sacrifices had taught him the value of quiet contribution over public praise, describing briefly, without excessive detail, the childhood experiences that had shaped his belief in dignified, unassuming generosity. Several board members listened with visible emotion as he spoke, recognizing in his simple explanation a depth of character that made Grace's dismissive treatment of him feel even more jarring in retrospect. He said the maintenance funds Grace blamed him for misusing had, in truth, been authorized by his own trust for emergency roof repairs months earlier, repairs the school desperately needed before winter storms threatened the building's structural integrity. Explaining the specific timeline and reasoning behind that authorization with the same calm precision he brought to every aspect of his ownership responsibilities. He had approved the transfer himself, never imagining it would become the excuse used to strip him of his badge in front of children who trusted him. His voice caught slightly on that final phrase, the only moment throughout his entire explanation where the emotional weight of what had happened visibly surfaced. A brief crack in his otherwise composed demeanor that seemed to affect the room more powerfully than any anger could have. Grace's eyes filled with tears she struggled to suppress, the full weight of her mistake finally crystallizing in a way that transcended simple legal or procedural failure, settling instead into something closer to genuine moral reckoning. The board sat with that revelation for a long moment, the weight of it settling over the room like a slow, sobering realization. Grace Yoon had not only humiliated an innocent man, she had done so using funds he himself had generously provided for the school's protection. Irony so complete that several board members found themselves momentarily unable to speak, simply absorbing the full scope of what had unfolded within their school over the past week. Diane Coker asked the obvious question that hung over the entire meeting. What did Elijah want to happen next? Every board member expected him to demand Grace's immediate termination, a public apology, perhaps even legal consequences for wrongful dismissal, the kind of response that would feel proportionate given the severity of what she had done. Frank Delgado had already begun mentally preparing to support whatever consequences Elijah requested, believing firmly that Grace's actions warranted serious professional repercussions regardless of any mitigating circumstances. Instead, Elijah paused, looked toward the window overlooking the courtyard where students were currently on recess, laughing and playing without any awareness of the reckoning unfolding above them, and said something no one in that room anticipated. He said he wanted the truth told plainly, but he did not want Grace destroyed over it. Grace looked up at him, visibly stunned by his response, unsure how to reconcile his mercy with the cruelty she had shown him only days earlier. She had braced herself throughout the entire meeting for the harshest possible consequences, believing on some level that she deserved whatever professional destruction might follow from her actions, and Elijah's unexpected restraint left her momentarily disoriented, unable to immediately process generosity she felt entirely undeserving of receiving. Elijah explained that revenge had never interested him, that he had built his entire quiet philosophy around lifting people up rather than tearing them down, even people who had wronged him deeply, drawing again on the values his mother had instilled in him decades earlier through her own quiet example of dignity in the face of hardship. He suggested instead that Grace be required to personally address the students and staff, acknowledging her mistake honestly, and that she undergo a period of supervised leadership training focused on humility and fair treatment of every employee, regardless of their position. He articulated this proposal with the same careful precision he brought to every business decision, recognizing that genuine accountability required more than simple punishment, that Grace's path toward becoming a better leader would ultimately serve the students far more meaningfully than her immediate removal from the position entirely. The board deliberated briefly before agreeing to his terms, recognizing both the wisdom in his approach and the public relations disaster it would prevent, though it was clear Elijah's motivation had nothing to do with optics and everything to do with the values his own mother had instilled in him decades earlier. Grace Yoon stood before the same gymnasium 1 week later. The same students and staff gathered in the same seats where she had once stripped Elijah of his badge. The morning carried an unusual heaviness as students filed in, many of them having watched the viral video multiple times over the past week, arriving with a mixture of curiosity and quiet anticipation about what this second assembly might reveal. Tyrell Combs sat in nearly the same spot he had occupied the week before, his posture noticeably different this time, sitting straighter, watching the front of the gymnasium with an attentiveness he rarely displayed during ordinary school announcements. Mrs. Alvarez stood near the science department section once again, though her expression carried none of the uneasy tension from the previous assembly, replaced instead by a quiet, hopeful curiosity about what accountability might actually look like when genuinely offered. This time, her voice trembled as she spoke, admitting publicly that she had judged a man based on his uniform rather than his character, and that she had been deeply, painfully wrong. Grace stood at the same podium where she had once delivered her confident, dismissive termination announcement, but the woman speaking now bore little resemblance to that composed, calculated figure from the previous week. She had spent the days leading up to this moment drafting and redrafting her remarks, discarding versions that felt too rehearsed, too focused on preserving her professional image rather than genuinely acknowledging the harm she had caused. What she ultimately delivered felt raw in a way that surprised even her, stripped of the practiced polish that had defined every previous public appearance throughout her tenure as principal. She described, in careful detail appropriate for the students listening, the misunderstanding that had led to her decision, taking full ownership of her failure to investigate properly before taking such a severe and public action. She acknowledged specifically the discomfort she had allowed to influence her judgment, admitting that she had dismissed Elijah's presence and familiarity within the building as suspicious rather than recognizing it as evidence of someone who genuinely cared about this community. Several students exchanged surprised glances at this level of vulnerability from an administrator they had only ever known as rigid and controlled, sensing that whatever had happened behind the scenes over the past week had fundamentally shifted something within her. She turned to Elijah, seated quietly near the front row, and offered an apology far more vulnerable than the confident authority she once projected in that same room. She addressed him directly this time, using his full name with a deliberate emphasis that felt almost ceremonial, acknowledging aloud what she had failed to recognize throughout years of working alongside him without ever bothering to learn who he truly was. She apologized specifically for the words she had used during his termination, repeating them aloud with visible difficulty, understanding that true accountability required naming the exact harm rather than offering only a vague, general apology that avoided confronting the specific cruelty of what she had said. Elijah accepted her apology with a simple nod, then stood and addressed the students directly, telling them that everyone deserves to be seen for who they truly are, not for the job they happen to be doing on any given day. He spoke without notes, his voice carrying the same calm steadiness that had defined his presence throughout 11 years of quiet service, though today he stood before them not as an anonymous custodian, but as a man finally allowed to speak plainly about values he had lived by his entire life. He mentioned, without excessive detail, his own mother's sacrifices, drawing a gentle connection between her invisible labor and the invisible labor so many people around them performed daily without recognition or gratitude. He looked toward Tyrell Combs specifically at one point during his remarks, offering a small, knowing smile that conveyed more genuine warmth than any formal acknowledgement could have provided. a private moment of connection between two people who understood something about feeling unseen that most of the room could never fully grasp. He encouraged the students to extend curiosity and respect toward everyone they encountered, regardless of title or position, reminding them gently that the people who often contribute the most meaningfully to their lives rarely announce their contributions loudly. The gymnasium, once heavy with humiliation, now held something closer to quiet reflection, students absorbing his words with an attentiveness that felt genuinely different from their usual restless assembly behavior. In the months that followed, Elijah returned to his familiar gray coveralls, choosing once again to walk the halls anonymously, though the students now understood the depth of the man they had underestimated for years. He resumed his usual morning routine, arriving before sunrise, moving quietly through hallways he had once again chosen to protect, through humble, unassuming presence, rather than any formal recognition of his ownership status. Students greeted him differently now, though he never sought or expected the shift in their behavior, simply continuing his quiet work with the same dedication he had always brought to this building, understanding that true purpose had never depended on whether others recognized it. Tyrell Combs began seeking him out more frequently during those following months, no longer hesitant about their friendship, despite now knowing the true scope of Elijah's position within the school. Their conversations remained largely unchanged in substance, still centered around ordinary teenage concerns and quiet encouragement during difficult stretches, though Tyrell now approached these exchanges with a deeper appreciation for the man offering them. Elijah continued funding scholarships and field trips through channels that remained largely anonymous to the broader student body, preferring that his generosity continue operating with the same quiet dignity he had always valued, even as select students and staff members now understood the true source behind opportunities that once felt mysteriously fortunate. Grace Yoon remained at the school, transformed by an experience that had stripped away her assumptions about power and position, working diligently to rebuild trust with a staff that had watched her humbled in front of an entire gymnasium. She completed the leadership training the board had required, engaging with the process far more seriously than anyone initially expected, recognizing genuinely that her previous approach to authority had prioritized control over the deeper relational trust necessary for meaningful leadership. She began implementing small but significant changes throughout the following semester, spending more unstructured time simply talking with staff members across every position within the school, actively working to understand perspectives she had previously dismissed as beneath her attention. Mrs. Alvarez noticed the shift gradually over subsequent months, watching Grace engage with maintenance staff and support personnel with a warmth that felt entirely absent during her first years leading the school. Their relationship remained complicated, marked by the lingering awareness of what had transpired, but Mrs. Alvarez found herself extending cautious goodwill toward a colleague genuinely attempting to grow from a painful, public mistake. Grace never fully escaped the weight of what she had done, carrying it quietly as a persistent reminder of how quickly assumption and unchecked authority could cause genuine harm to someone who had only ever offered this community generosity in return. Marcus Webb continued managing the trust quietly, ensuring the school's future remained secure long after this particular chapter closed, his professional relationship with Elijah deepening into something closer to genuine friendship, following the events that had briefly threatened to expose years of carefully maintained confidentiality. He occasionally visited the school himself, checking in on renovation projects or trust-related matters, always struck by the quiet, unassuming way Elijah continued moving through hallways he owned, entirely by choice, in the same gray coveralls that had once caused an entire building to underestimate him so completely. And somewhere in that building, in a hallway once filled with tension and misunderstanding, a mop bucket rolled softly across freshly cleaned floors, pushed by a man who never needed recognition to know the value of what he had built. Elijah Marsh continued his quiet routine for years afterward, watching new generations of students move through hallways he had saved from closure, contributing to countless lives that would never fully understand the depth of sacrifice, quietly protecting their daily experience within these walls. He remained, by every measure that mattered most to him, exactly the man his mother had raised him to be, valuing dignity and quiet generosity over any recognition the world might have otherwise offered him. Perhaps the hardest truths are not the ones hidden in locked drawers or private trust documents, but the quiet assumptions we carry every day about the people who serve us without complaint. Grace Yoon believed she understood the full measure of everyone working beneath her, yet she never once thought to ask the name of the man responsible for the very roof over her head. Elijah Marsh, in turn, never sought credit for his sacrifice, choosing instead to measure his worth by the lives he quietly touched, rather than the titles he could have claimed. Would you have recognized the man in gray coveralls for who he truly was? Or would you, like so many others in that gymnasium, have looked away without a second thought? Let us know your answer in the comments below.